Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today is Nivi Jaswal. Please welcome her to the show. It's very nice to meet you.
It's very nice to meet you too, Chef AJ, and I can't wait to share my story and our today's topic with everyone.
I feel the same way because the world is a big place and so many people are doing so many extraordinary things. We're not all doing the same thing. We're not all cooking kale. And I love the work that you're doing. And I'd love the viewers to find out a little bit more about that and you.
Yes, absolutely. Are you okay if I were to share my PowerPoint now?
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about colonialism, cuisine, and the cow, and India's dilemma with development, dairy, and diabetes. And before I launch into that, I want to share a little bit about myself. I'm from the northwestern part of India. It's a state called Punjab, so I identify as a Punjabi. My hometown of Ludhiana is also called the home of butter chicken. I was born to these fabulous anthropologist parents who witnessed the dairy revolution as it happened in South Asia. And they were part of the network of the state agricultural universities, both in India as well as in the United States. I suffered a lot of personal losses. I lost all four of my grandparents to chronic illness and a grand aunt to chronic illness before I turned 18. And that was a big shift in how I viewed food and nutrition. And off late in COVID-19 as well, I've lost several family members, including my father. So that's been hard. I studied psychology, sociology, economics, consumer behavior marketing. I have a corporate background. I've done direct consumer research in more than 15 countries and traveled to another 47. And I run a nonprofit in the Boston area. It's called the Versa Foundation, and we run a research program called the Divinity Research Program at my nonprofit, where we do a lot of ethnographic, quantitative, and qualitative research. But when did I start connecting the dots? And none of these dots that you see connected out here could have actually prepared me for what happened to me in 2015. I found myself in a hotel room, fallen on the floor, in Hong Kong in 2015. And I didn't understand how I'd gotten there. My heart rate was very high. I checked it on my watch. It was close to 166 beats per minute. And I was positive that I'd had a cardiac event. Promptly the next morning, took a flight back home. Home was Singapore at that point in time. Checked myself into a hospital. I walked in as supposedly a healthy person. I walked out a patient, a label that I absolutely did not want to identify myself with. And since then, what has unfolded has been a journey of exploration and of connecting the dots, and obviously my healing, which is why I'm even here. Because honestly, had I not discovered a whole food, plant-based, oil-free approach to nutrition, I probably might not have survived. I was on a ketogenic diet, and we know it can lead people to a very dark place, and so it led me, to a very dark place with prediabetes, with polycystic ovarian syndrome, with extreme tachycardia, with insomnia, debilitating insomnia. Couldn't sleep longer than 3 hours. But then once I healed myself by January of 2019, I just embarked on this journey of understanding what led me to where I had gotten to when I found myself on that, on the floor of that hotel room in 2015. And it, led to a lot of revelation, and which is where I connected those dots. And I'm here to share with you more about colonialism, cuisine, the cow, the dilemma with development, with dairy, and with diabetes.
Wow, that must have been really scary.
Yeah, that was extremely scary. It was traumatic, honestly. Like, I had no clue how I'd landed myself in that situation, because I was going to the gym. I wasn't visibly obese. I I was doing keto, and keto is the fad of the day. All healthy people who go to the gym drink tons of whey protein and bullet coffee. They do keto, and they seem not to get diabetic. But wasn't the case with me.
Wow. So, and that's exactly what they diagnosed you with.
Yes, they diagnosed me with pre-diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, extreme insomnia. They put a Holter monitor on me. They wanted to see if there was structurally something wrong with my heart. They couldn't find anything structurally wrong, except that I was extremely insulin resistant. And I was 35 at the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, you weren't that old. You're not that old now, but that's pretty young.
Yes, and they put me on hormone replacement therapy with thyroxine and everything, with hypothyroidism. So that was very scary, and I just didn't want to be at the mercy of a pill for the rest of my life. So I had to figure this out. All right. Okay. I'm ready if you are, Chef AJ. Should we launch into this? Okay. So let's start with South Asia. It's also known as the Indian subcontinent. The part of the world that's shaded in orange on your screen. It's 3.5% of the world's land surface, but it hosts almost 1 in 4 of the world's population, including a very diverse population. Religion-wise, 98% of Hindus live in the Indian subcontinent, 90% of Sikhs. I'm 50% Sikh and 50% Hindu, by the way. 31% of Muslims worldwide, and then Christians, Buddhists, Jains, Zoroastrians, and so many other tribal indigenous religions and ways of life that probably a lot of people in the world haven't even heard of. So suffices to say, very, very diverse corner of the world. Now, dairy in modern India, that's another story, and we're going to talk about that in significant detail. India is the world's #1 dairy producer and also the #1 consumer of dairy in the world. The domestic market is valued at $225 billion US, and milk is produced by 300 million bovines across 75 million dairy farms. And that's the largest number of dairy farms in any country in the entire world. And about 6% of the country's population is actively engaged in the dairy industry. That's around 100 million plus of dairy farmers. And I'm not even including all the people that are part of the dairy ecosystem in terms of, artificial insemination, scientifically breeding these animals, animal nutrition and pesticides and oxytocin injections and distribution and, commercialization and marketing of this milk. So dairy in modern India is a huge, daunting experiment that the Indian government undertook. We'll see how tradition, played into it and what part of it was something totally different. So here's our hypothesis. The hypothesis is that modern India's nutritional emphasis on dairy is an outcome of colonialism and not tradition. And we're going to look at dismantling the myths, the mythology, the perceptions, some real, some imaginary, around why Indians believe and why the rest of the world believes that dairy is a traditional part of the Indian diet. So which dots are we not connecting? And it turns out there are many of them. There is the developmental dot. There's colonialism, there's cuisine, culture, the chai culture in India, and diabetes. And for that, I invite you on a quick tour of India over the ages. We're going to visit 2 distinct phases of ancient India, medieval India, which saw the rise of Islamic rule, and also starting in the late medieval era when the British showed up in the form of the East India Company, and then we'll get into modern India. But let's talk about the cows first. When did ancient Indians start domesticating them? And we're really talking about Neolithic India. Neolithic times in India start around 7000 BC. The human transition from nomadism to pastoralism is traditionally linked to domestication of bovine mammals. And this is true for Europe as it's true for South Asia. And the South Asian, the daddy of the cow that led to the modern Indian cow was this big hunk that's on your screen. He was Bos primigenius nomadicus. He was the ancestor of the modern Indian breed of cows, Bos indicus. And he was the ancient wild bovine mammal that roamed Neolithic South Asia, specifically in the northwestern part of South Asia, where I'm from. When we look at the footprint of early pastoralism in India, the first people to domesticate the bovine mammals were from the Northwest, especially from Punjab, the area where I come from. And then it spread to key parts of Central India, South India, and eventually Eastern India. Now, what is the difference? The two primary breeds of bovine mammals on Earth, the European cows, which you see on advertising, the pastures and the cow with the black and white spots on its body, that's the famous Holstein breed of cow. The South Asian cows are slightly different, as you can tell. So let's look at what is the difference between these two bovine mammals, even though they're the same species. So the European Bos taurus adapted to colder weather, early onset of puberty, faster growing, higher fertility rates, higher yields of both milk and meat. When you look at the South Asian Bos indicus, it has a humped back, loose skin. I'll bring it back here. It's disease resistant. It's hardy. It has lower fertility rates. It's adapted to hot and humid tropical weather, delayed onset of puberty, very unreliable reproductive patterns, and poor yields of milk. So what did really the early South Asians eat? And was dairy a part of their daily menu? We're going to have to look at some zoological evidence, some archaeozoological evidence, and some genetic evidence. Let's get into it. Now, archaeological evidence indicates that ancient Indians consumed a high fiber, diverse, plant predominant diet. This specific research and these findings, they were published as recently as January 2021 in the Journal of Archaeological Science. And what we see here is 10 different types of millets. So we don't see a lot of wheat. A lot of people believe that wheat and rice, that's what Indians eat. Not really. 10 types of millets. That's the ancient grain that Indians ate. There were 3 different types of cereals. There were 8 pulses, lots of lentils and beans, and some evidence of fruits and vegetables and spices, including ginger and garlic. And this is not a comprehensive list for the simple reason that these are, ceramic residues and archaeological artifacts. And as we all know, hot, humid weather, isn't a big friend of survival of a lot of macrobiotic botanical residue. So, all right, this sets the stage. South Asians were predominantly plant-based. Now let's look at some of the chemical analysis findings of fat deposits that have happened in ancient Indian cookware. And when we look at that, this one specific study, there were 2 studies that you find. All of the data that I'm sharing with you guys is from the public domain. The citations are in this document. Very happy to share with if there are any questions around that. In January 2021, there was a study that actually calculated the lipid residues in pottery from the Indus Valley civilization. And they found low fat concentrations. The vessels that did have some fat deposits, it seemed they were predominantly sourced from smaller animals, not bovines. And when I say smaller animals, maybe they were sheep, they were goats, maybe they were pigs. Traces of plant-based oils were found, and there was very limited evidence of dairy fats. They did find some evidence, but it was very limited. Again, in January, in 2020, I think it was fall of 2020, another similar compound specific isotope analysis happened. And this time they focused on the western part of India. And this neatly kind of maps over the current modern state of Gujarat in India. So they collected, the vessels went through a very similar process as the previous study, and they took 53 samples. Values of 5 indicated presence of dairy fat. That's less than 10%. A total of 21 samples indicated presence of adipose fat, which basically means it's not dairy fat, which is a secondary exploitation of bovine animals we see in history, but really adipose fat, which is from the flesh, indicating that perhaps this was, these were remains of both ruminant and non-ruminant animals that might have been had by early humans in South Asia. And one indicated aquatic fat. And that's not surprising given that this is a coastal area. And this evidence was derived from absorbed lipid residues. It was a sedentary to semi-sedentary agro-pastoral settlement. And so we're steadily, as these slides progress, we're moving forward in time. And we're starting to see cookware. We've established domestication of bovines, and we're starting to see the types of fats that they were eating. A very important part here is India is not a uni-bovine culture. India is a dual bovine culture. And what do I mean by that? That there were 2 simultaneous domestication patterns that we actually see emerge. And one is that of the Bos indicus, and the other one is that of the river buffalo, and that is the Bubalus bubalus. Archaeological evidence indicates that it was, for the very first time, domesticated in northwestern India, probably found its way into Iran, and then into the Middle East, and then into Europe, all the way from India. There are seals that tell us about that. They depict images of these buffaloes. Primary role in pastoral agriculture, and some data suggestive of consumption as meat. And there is insufficient data, or rather there was no data that I at least was able to find on exploitation for dairy processing of the river buffalo. And this also tells us one thing, that there is a scholarly preoccupation with the cow when it comes to wanting to connect the dots between traditional dairy consumption in India to modern day habits. And the river buffalo is treated often as a distant cousin. And also it's used in ritualistic sacrifice. There is a demon, so-called demon in Hindu mythology called Mahishasura, and the ride of that demon is the water buffalo. So it's quite the opposite of the the venerated, worshipped cow versus the river buffalo, even though it plays a big role in the dairy, modern day dairy culture in India. So what do we see? We see that there is emergence of pastoral agrarian economies. They're dependent on these 2 bovine species, but nutritionally, they're whole food, plant-based predominantly. Now, here's another thing that happened. The Indus Valley civilization it just abruptly ended. A lot of people don't know. There's a lot of hypotheses that have been offered in the past decades. Widely accepted hypothesis is that of climate reconstruction. So the Indus Valley basin was also composed of tributaries, and the tributaries of the Indus River was around where a lot of these settlements had come about, and they were monsoon fed. And rapid aridification or desertification led to these tributaries drying up, and it forced people to move eastward. And that actually brings us to the next phase of big, large-scale human action that shifted to the Indo-Gangetic plains. But before I go there, Chef AJ, do you have questions for me?
Not so much questions, but what I find fascinating is that when you discovered that they were a primarily plant-based culture and that nobody seems to know that.
Exactly. I think that it's a curious case of media share of voice. And some things get more glorified than the others. And unfortunately, in human history, not just in South Asia, but the rest of the world, there has been a preoccupation with animal protein to the extent that there is almost this yearning where human beings want, almost like they want to find a connection that somehow tells them that what they're doing at this point in time is right, and that their ancestors also lived by the same nutritional ethic.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you had mentioned that dairy is a traditional part of the Indian culture now. I'd almost argue that it's become a traditional part of every culture at this point.
Yes, it is indeed. And that is exactly the hypothesis that we're trying to dismantle and challenge, that yes, it is indeed part of modern culture. Whether it's traditionally motivated or not, that's a separate question. So, and as we're discovering, as you can see, nutritionally, South Asians, ancient South Asians, were predominantly whole food plant-based. There is no doubt about that.
I think every culture at one point was predominantly whole food plant-based.
Indeed, indeed, absolutely. All right, we go over to a very exciting phase of Indian history. One that is much talked about, and I think it's also exported a lot of concepts like yoga, Ayurveda, the legend of Lord Krishna, and the symbolism associated with his life to the rest of the world. So a lot of that amazing, Vedic ancient history came from this phase, which is the Vedic Pastoralism, the Indian Kingdom age, and it's typically between 1500 BC to 1200 AD. Let's look at it closely. Now, the legend of Krishna, who was born himself, he was born purportedly in 3228 BC. So Krishna didn't necessarily belong to the age where he achieved the exalted status of a Hindu deity. Obviously, in most likelihood, he came from a more mature late stage Indus Valley civilization settlement in what you see on the screen in north central India. And at the time when his legend and his stories and the mythology started to flourish, north central India, in north central India, the domestication of both Bos indicus as well as the Bubalus bubalus, and I'm going to stop geeking out on these terms, but I'll just say the cow and the river buffalo, the domestication of both these species was in full swing. So when we look at mythology, not just Krishna mythology, any kind of mythology, it's the oldest form of advertising. It is, it's the stories that human beings and our ancestors wanted progressive generations to hear and to catalog and to document and to write about and sing about. And Krishna was deemed the protector of the Bos indicus, the epicenter of Vedic life. Access to the cow defined everything. Access to the cow was a caste-based privilege. We'll get into the caste system in a bit. Securing oxen for agriculture and obviously, newly agrarian economy in the Vedic times from low fertility cows was difficult. And processing dairy from the lower yields that they were giving was difficult too. And obviously in the absence of any scientific breeding, artificial insemination, and so on, you could only get dairy when the cow was lactating. So everything from the cow manure to cow dairy had to be venerated, celebrated, glorified, written, and sung about. And Krishna offered the most, amenable example of, someone who was a cowherd. He was romanticized as a musician. He would play his flute. All the cows would be around him, and that he was the protector of this vital nerve center of the Vedic economy. When we look at ghee, and I'm actually skipping over into dairy, we're zooming into dairy, obviously, in this conversation. And I want to talk about ghee. And when we look at the Sanskrit word for ghee, it's grit. Grit is actually from a root word that means to sprinkle. And I'll say it again, to sprinkle, not dump in dollops on top of your khichdi. It has many uses. It's used in fire worship to placate Lord Agni. Lord Agni is the fire god in Hindu pantheon. It's used as a topical application for ointments in Ayurveda. And in Ayurvedic texts, it's used in minuscule amounts in oral pharmaceutical formulations that are prepared by seasoned Ayurvedic practitioners. And it is categorized as tridoshic. When I say that, it actually refers to the three doshas. And in Ayurveda, there are three humors, three constitutions, and Ayurveda seeks to balance these three humors. And it is said that ghee balances these three humors. But it's a very important thing to notice. It's contraindicated in situations and conditions of high ama. And ama is nothing but the Sanskrit word for toxic inflammation. So even though we're looking at Krishna mythology and we're choosing to look at this mythological, plethora of advertising that Indian culture has inherited, when we look into a key dairy derivative that is sacrosanct, we realize that when you dig deep into the Vedic texts, it's a pharmaceutical ingredient, and it's not necessarily a kitchen ingredient to be trusted to home cooks. And that's a very important distinction that we need to make, which unfortunately a lot of people in South Asia, not just the South Asia, but the diaspora, and even non-South Asians who are interested in Ayurvedic nutrition, Indian cooking, etc., they're not able to really make that connection. So just the way you're not gonna sprinkle amoxicillin on your soup to make it nutritionally, delicious and other things, the same way you're not gonna sprinkle ghee, which is a pharmaceutical ingredient, on top of your khichdi or your soup or anything else. So that's the key message.
I love that. That's a good takeaway. Don't sprinkle amoxicillin on your soup.
Yep. And let's talk about ahimsa as well, because we're connecting the dots, right? We're connecting the symbolism around Krishna and ghee and ahimsa. And when something is that precious and it's that rare, you want to seek to preserve it. But it's important to notice that ahimsa was a doctrine. It was a philosophical doctrine in Vedic texts. A lot of Indologists have written about it, that ahimsa was not expected of everyone. It potentially originated in the world of renouncers, section of society that renounced everything, and they were asked to adopt ahimsa. It maybe then was adopted by the Brahmins, who were the priestly class in the Indian caste system. And then over time, it evolved into a general rule for the rest of the society. So ahimsa and vegetarianism, they go hand in hand, but they're not necessarily directly correlated. But when you look at the need of the day, back in the Vedic times, to sustain pastoral transition to settled agrarian society, Bos indicus had to be protected. So the easiest way was to create a rule. And the rule was no slaughter for consumption, strict definitions of when and what kind of cows could be used for ritualistic sacrifice. So which is why I'll take you back to one of my earlier slides that mentioned that the river buffalo, the poor cousin of the cows, were then the preferred victims of ritualistic sacrifice. And if it had to be a cow, it could be an aging ox, or it could be a barren cow, a cow that was proven that it was not going to bear any more calves going forward. And basically what ended up happening was the culture leveraged the philosophical inclination of ahimsa doctrine of the day and promoted vegetarianism. So that's where the root of vegetarianism really comes from. Now, for the very early Vedic peoples, dairy was important. It was liquid gold. And the Indo-Aryan caste system offered a framework for systemic access of it, or the lack of it. So when we look at the indigenous natives of India, they were outside the pale of the Aryanization. These were the people potentially leftovers leftover from the extinct Indus Valley civilization, and they were systematically pushed downwards when the Indo-Aryans came in. They were pushed southwards. When we look at the Kshudras, who were the laborers, as part of the caste system, which is also called the Varnashrama Dharma, which incidentally is also the term for color or class. So in a way, the caste system was another term for colorism. It's key to note that while these cattle grazers and the herdsmen, they were considered part of the caste system, but their ability to pay for dairy and ghee did not exist. So even if you were growing or raising cattle and grazing cattle and milking them, you still were from the low caste. And the guys who really had the capability of being able to pay for it and they could afford it were the top castes. That were the Brahmins, the priests, or the Kshatriyas, the warriors, and the Vaishyas, who were the traders. And specifically the priests, because a lot of the Ayurvedic physicians, people who had access to the scripture, people who had access to knowledge and the Vedas, were more likely to be Brahmins and people who utilized the dairy derivative, that is ghee. I know I'm sharing a lot of complex concepts. So should there be any questions, just let
No,
me know.
I'm just, it's really fascinating. I feel like I'm in a college level course and that this could be your dissertation for your PhD.
Thank you so much for saying that.
But I'm also thinking the people that really need to see this are the Indian audience, which are not necessarily people that are watching me on YouTube, because I think they have these long held beliefs. Like you say, I was interviewing a lifestyle medicine doctor in India. She was actually the president of the Indian Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And she said that people believe that ghee is medicinal, that is their medicine. You can't tell people not to take medicine.
Exactly, except that medicine is dispensed by a person who's trained to dispense it. And I think that's a critical, link that a lot of are not able to make so far. And that's when the cultural rationalizations step in, right? So there you go. In front of you, you've got the system, the caste system of India, which is also the system of colorism in India. So when you look at the colors, the color coding on this pyramid, it could well be like that, because the Indo-Aryans descended from Western Eurasians, and they came in through Central Asia, and a lot of them had, they were fairer skinned, they were fairer complexioned, their noses, the cheekbones were different, the texture of their hair was different. And when you look at a lot of genomic sequencing studies that have been conducted in South Asia, a lot of the indigenous protohistoric natives of India, especially in the central southern part, they share a lot of genetic markers with the African populations, as compared to the northwestern North Indian populations. And that's a big box of its own, which is another dissertation for another time, I think, Chef AJ. But moving on, this is exactly the system of access to dairy and dairy derivatives. Now, it's important for us to find out that if there were people with such differential access to dairy and dairy derivatives, how did that show up, if at all, in their genetic makeup? And how did that impact their lactose intolerance or tolerance levels? So before we go there, we also want to understand, were these people falling sick? And yes, by the way, there is evidence of cardiometabolic disease, and there is a correlation with affluence, with access to these cholesterol-rich animal-based foods. Both ancient physicians in China and in India noted the presence of prediabetes and diabetes. And they said that, I'm actually quoting from a research that I found, it said that it's a disease of affluence and it's among wealthier individuals who were heavier set. And again, in a contemporary civilization to that of the Indus Valley civilization, which is the Egyptian civilization, which offers us a great opportunity by way of the mummified corpses, to see and to get in and have a closer look at if there was presence of heart disease. And sure enough, as a US Egyptian research team found out recently, that almost 50% of the mummies, which is a sampling of the elite in ancient Egypt, showed evidence of atherosclerosis in one or more of their arteries. And given that South Asians typically practiced burial, not burial, some burial, but then cremation, and cremation was prevalent, continues to be preferred practice for Hindus. We don't have evidence that has survived to modern day to be able to see this. So, which is where I wanted to draw a parallel with a contemporary civilization that existed and with which ancient Indians had active trade links. And also just, another point to note that Indian civilization was not the only one to have used medicated fat, such as ghee. The Egyptians were also known to use medicated fat, and the base could have been bovine, the basis could have been goats. I think it was goats in their case, and it was called samna, Saamna. So that was the ghee equivalent for the Egyptians and some of the other civilizations in Asia Minor and the Middle East. So this was interesting. And when we look at the diagnosis of diabetes in Ayurveda and the Ayurvedic prescription of it, it is overwhelmingly a recommendation in favor of a whole food. By the trilogy of Ayurvedic physicians, Sushruta, Charaka, and Bhagavata, these three. And they said, if you pour urine of a patient who is suspected to be suffering from diabetes on the ground, and you observe it, if ants are drawn to it, then it's most likely a urinary abnormality. And of the different, 20 types of prameha, or the urinary abnormalities that the Ayurvedic physicians were able to identify, the one that was called type 2 diabetes, which is diabetes mellitus type 2, was called madhumeha. And madhu is the word for honey. So it means honey urine or sweet urine. So in addition to Ayurvedic remedies that they might have prescribed, several texts recommend, there's not an exhaustive list, but I came across lots and lots of herbs. There's turmeric, there's amla, neem leaves, curry leaves, cabbage, carrot, broccoli, beetroot, citrus fruits, whole grains, sprouts, chickpeas, beans, cinnamon, fenugreek, and aloe vera. And as you can tell, this is the list. This is exactly what's on the menu of somebody who practices a whole foods, plant-based, oil-free diet. And then we already know that ghee is contraindicated in case a person has high ama, and diabetes mellitus, even in the Vedic age, would have definitely qualified as one of those conditions. So this was very interesting to find. Now we're going to the crux of, one of the things that was very fascinating for me personally when I was doing this research. What's the genetic verdict on lactose metabolism in South Asia? Because we've had this millennium of ghee preceding us, and all these notions of, we had this abundance of dairy in South Asia, everybody was swimming in it and so on. If it was really, really true, then it should show up in our genetic makeup. And the one genetic mutation that, has been used as a gold standard so far, it's a basic flip between a C and a T. So if 13910C becomes 13910T, it means that lactase persistence has been achieved via positive selection. So recently there was a study. It comprised of 2,284 individuals from 106 populations living in the Indian subcontinent, and their salivas were taken. They took samples of their saliva, and they were trying to figure out if this positive selection and the presence of this genetic mutation 13910T was present. And as you can see on the slide, on the right side, whatever's red, yellow, and green, there is lactase persistence in that area. And whatever's blue and dark blue, those people cannot at all metabolize dairy or any of its lactose derivatives. So what they found out was 4 out of 5 Indians in the sample were lactose intolerant. And lactose intolerance increases in South Asia as you go southward and eastward. And if you remember the maps I've shared with you before, they map and superimpose very neatly over the domestication of bovines map and also early settlements where they found some limited dairy processing. And one thing that it's important to note is this is not happy news for people of my tribe from Punjab. They cannot just assume that, oh, okay, we've got the carte blanche to now go ahead and have our dollops of dairy. Lactase persistence in parts of northwestern India do not imply 100% of the population carries this mutation. Just the same way that just because this mutation exists in the Scandinavian populations, it does not imply that a 100% of the Scandinavian populations are lactase persistent or lactose tolerant. So that's just a little caveat that I wanted to leave there. So all of this is fascinating because now we've connected archaeozoological evidence, isotopic analysis of fat residues in ceramics, and we've got the genetic verdict. And all of it goes to prove that early South Asians were traditionally predominantly whole food plant-based.
That's incredible. Where did you do how did you do the research for this?
Public domain. It's open. It's open source. All you got to do is look up, Google Scholar. And also, I have to. This is a great question because one of the things that I looked out for when people were bragging about how culturally prevalent dairy is, and they were using science, but they were misinterpreting those scientific documents. So I looked for those headlines, dream headlines that everybody wants to see because people want good news about their bad habits. And when I started to look into those headlines, there were headlines like, so for instance, when I shared with you about the fat residue, one of the headlines was direct linkage of dairy processing in South Asia. The myth, finally revealed. Yes, it's in our, ancestry. And I looked through that news report. The journalist had very, intentionally cherry picked what they wanted to write and how they wanted to position that news report. But when you actually look into the science and go into the scientific, article and the data, some of which I had to purchase online, and it's easy to purchase. It's like $35, $25 for a piece. And when you actually start looking at that piece of research, you realize, no, that's not exactly what the scientists found. They found 5 out of 53 vessels had fat in them. And even then, even just a small fraction of that had dairy fat in it. The rest was probably indicative of meat consumption. So people cherry pick. And then, as Dr. T. Colin Campbell says in his plant-based nutrition course, which is a fantastic course, is that there is a lot of, I think he uses the term SCRAP. It's an acronym. And he says that look for things that are not scientific, but presented in a scientific way. Look for things that do not have proper authorship attributed to them. Look for things where math has been distorted to tell a certain story because people want to hear that story.
I wonder if other cultures would do this if they'd find pretty much the same results you had.
Possibly. Yeah, absolutely.
When you think about it, just Asia in general, you don't see historically Chinese people of Chinese descent or Japanese descent drinking tons of milk or making recipes with milk.
Exactly. And I think that, in Chinese culture, China at this point in time is the number 3 dairy producer in the world. And that is a shocking anomaly because when you look at the Chinese cuisine, traditionally, there isn't any use of dairy in Chinese cuisine. Now, all of that probably is colonial heritage, and most of it, post the Opium Wars that happened in China, which is also linked to colonialism, and I guess the majority of it after the Second World War, and then rapid rise in the Chinese economy that you saw in the early 90s, which maps also with the increase in the GDP rates of growth in both India and China, but China grew far more rapidly as compared to India.
Yeah.
And we know that westernization, urbanization, adoption of a Western diet is correlated with rise in chronic illness.
You know, it's interesting because I think most cultures and most people probably are lactose intolerant to some degree, yet it doesn't seem to stop them from ingesting what is really an unnatural substance for their physiology.
Yes, absolutely. And it didn't stop me, like I used to have lots and lots of uh, dairy, and it just didn't stop me. I felt it was a complete nutrition. We will see as we get into modern India, as to how systemically and systematically it's generations of brainwash, right? And with good intent, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people who thought that they were setting up the dairy infrastructure in India were doing the right thing, but the basis and their assumption was that somebody told them this was the right thing to do, and that person, or not that person, but that mindset or that intention may not have been in favor of what Indians genetically have eaten for the past so many years, thousands of years.
The thing is, dairy is so addictive, as we know from the work of Dr. Neil Barnard in his book, The Cheese Trap and Body Imbalance, that once someone starts, it's very difficult to get them off of it.
Yes, exactly. Casomorphins, right? And the beta casomorphins are, Dr. Barnard has written about it. Dr. Esselstyn spoke about it too. It's very potent. And we're going to see how India became the chai republic, Chef AJ, because chai has dairy in it with the casomorphins. It has sugar in it, which we know is more addictive than cocaine. And it has tea, sugar, and yeah, so basically it's like and dairy in it, right? Chai has dairy in it, so it's just like and tea has caffeine in it, so it's just a really drug-like substance that the Indians got hooked to. So let's get to that part, and I'm going to zoom through a lot of these slides now. So Krishna's prescription for lifestyle actually resulted into the world's first ever food pyramid, is what I'm calling it, which is the Sattvic, Rajasic, and the Tamasic food pyramid. And he first mentions it in the song of the Bhagwada Gita in chapter 17, and it's offered in the form of gunas. It's not really a nutritional prescription. It's a lifestyle, mind, body kind of a prescription. It's the three modes of existence that human beings can be in. And somehow it's linked to you are what you eat. So it says that if you eat dead carcasses and dead animals and the flesh of animals, and we can add to that the lactation fluids of animals, because we know that that's also tamasic, it's going to turn you into this lazy, lackadaisical person who has an obesogenic profile, and it is going to impact your mind as well. When you look at rajasic, the word is actually derived from king, eat like a king. So all the kings of the day and the elites of the day, also when we look at the Egyptian mummies, and when we look at diabetes being described as disease of affluence, you see that they eat a combination of rajasic and tamasic food, primarily because they could afford it and have access to it, and then ended up creating a lot of notions of, if you're fatter, if you're plumper, then you must be wealthy. And which then creates a lot of aspirational hooks in so many different cultures, and including, in Western European culture. When we look at Victorian England, much of the same aspirational hooks were at work because the British aristocracy had a lot of access to cholesterol-rich animal foods. And what Krishna really prescribes is that sattvic existence, which is a whole food, plant-based existence, is the one that can bring you closest to spiritual self-actualization. So this was the lifestyle guidance, and dare I say, very, very pertinent and applicable in the day of today, and even more so when we have chronic illness and we have a pandemic, going on at this point. All right, word on tea, very quickly, all about balancing the doshas. South Asians did not consume tea. Chai is not traditional to India. They consumed herbal infusions, and they had the vata, pitta, and the kapha teas, and these are all herbal infusions. Moving on very quickly from this, let's get into the next phase of the Indian history, which is the Mughal cuisine from the Persian court in India. This is a rule, this is a period which saw Islamic rule over India, and typically it's from circa 1200 to 1800 AD. right up to the time when the East India Company started to show up in India. So now the Mughal kitchen was very unique because the Mughals were these, Persian invaders. They were invaders from Central Asia, from Iran and other parts that came in. They brought in Islam into South Asia. They were likely more lactase persistent than the Hindu majority population that they ruled over. They wanted to adapt. They were there to stay. They banned cow slaughter, bearing in mind the Hindu sentiment. They also abstained from pork consumption, thereby creating a cuisine that might have more animal, inclusions into it, but not red meat still. And red meat as defined as beef and pork, and they framed their cuisine with heavy dairy usage and creamy desserts, and reinforced the aspiration for dairy that already had started to take root in the Vedic age. So how did the Mughal Empire reshape the socio-economic framework of access and aspiration? One of the big things that they told us is that we truly eat with our senses. Mughal court epitomized that. The Mughal menu proves that the power of language in framing human relationship with food is, important. And they adopted Persian as the language of the Mughal court, a language that must have sounded very foreign and exotic to the Indo-Aryan ears of the day. So we'll see how that the language of power, royalty, and luxury changed Indians' view of what aspirational food really might have been. So this is a quick look at the royal menu. It's the dessert menu of the Indo-Persian court. You can see words like Shahi Paneer. Shahi is the word derived from the Shahs, right? So the cheese, paneer is the word for cheese that is fit for royalty, Shahi Paneer. If you go to an Indian wedding, especially in the northwestern part of India, you're very likely to see some of these words listed, because when northwestern Indians, especially Punjabis, when they're entertaining guests and it's an important occasion, they want to give a royal treatment. So that is exactly where they're deriving their sense of royalty, superiority, aspiration from. And you see that the Mughal Empire effectively branded a lot of these culinary explorations that use culinary experiments that used dairy and dairy derivatives. Do you have a question? You're a chef, Chef AJ.
No, I'm just my light on. My mind is being blown, and I'm thinking this. I feel like I should be paying for this at a conference. That's how good this is. But it is just so interesting to me how this is how it started. With, I don't know, my mind is blown. Some of these products, I've never actually even used as a chef because I'm allergic to milk. So I never had to deal with that.
Exactly. Yes. And to think of an entire population who is allergic to milk, because human beings are, it's okay to be lactose normal. I mean, that's the state of our relationship with lactose and with other things in milk too, which are equally toxic. But, human beings are creative. We're a species that live by our senses, and the royal menu in the Mughal Empire actually epitomized that, and it made it very aspirational. So, and what was their policy, on meat consumption and cow slaughter? They had some very specific rules. They imposed cow slaughter, as I mentioned, prohibition on cow slaughter, and they didn't necessarily do it as a gesture of, goodwill for the Hindu majority that they were ruling, but it was also to seize the legal cases taken against Muslims for cow slaughter and for killing of peacocks. So they wanted to, create a policy, and I think that further drove the current mentality that South Asia tends to have, that the only source of superior protein equals animal protein that they can get is from dairy and not necessarily meat. And that leads to an overemphasis on dairy in that part of the world versus, an emphasis on meat, which we see in the Western cultures.
Why were they killing peacocks? What was that for?
I think that a couple of things. I mean, peacocks, number one, they were exotic. The Central Asian rulers didn't see peacocks in Central Asia. They were a tropical bird. So they were exotic. They wanted to probably use them for adornment ornamental purposes. And also they potentially ate peacock meat. I did find a reference to peacock meat as exotic meat. And that wasn't just limited to the Mughals, because early British interest in India also led them to exporting a lot of wild species, wild birds, wildlife species, and to see if they could explore eating game meat and wildlife meat. And the more exotic a bird or an animal is, it feeds some sort of a human fetish, it seems like, Chef AJ. So the killing of peacocks eventually, was banned, thankfully, by the Mughal Empire. A quick word on tea, because we're going to move very quickly into the Chai Republic. So before the British rule, the Mughal court elite consumed tea in very small medicinal quantities, and there is some evidence on them having imported it directly from China, or it having found its way to where the Persian rulers or the Mughal rulers came from. So if they were from Central Asia, different parts of Central Asia, they had trade links, because remember, we're also on the Silk Route, right? Silk Route is on one of the oldest roads that passes from China, also parts of India, and then gets into Central Asia. In fact, my hometown is on one of those ancient roads. It's called the Grand Trunk Road, and it starts in eastern India and goes all the way to Afghanistan. And so you imagine that a lot of these exotic things found their way to different parts of the world, including to India as well as to the Central Asian parts. But none of them had tea the way the British like to have it. So that brings us to the East India Tea Company and the sinister trifecta of sugar, dairy, and tea, and the empire that was built on international trade and the Industrial Revolution. Now, here's a really interesting point. All previous invader rulers stayed on in India. They adapted to it, and they eventually embraced India as their motherland. The British had no such intent. Their earliest presence in India in the late 1600s was in the form of a trading company, which then grew to become trading outposts, grew to become military outposts, brought in missionary presence, and ultimately passed under the crown as part of the British Empire. And all for a cup of a sugary, milky tea. And we see the royalty added again. You can't blame the British for this, actually. The Portuguese princess that married King Charles II is to be blamed for this. So in England, in 1630s, the price of tea was as high as 600 pounds to 1,000 pounds of today, in today's current currency terms. And it was sold as an excellent, by all means, physicians approved, China drink. So the British, developed this fascination for tea. In 1662, King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, and she brought in her dowry a chest of tea and the island of Bombay for an annual lease of 10 pounds, which was an equivalent of the then, cost of a pound of tea in England at that point. And Catherine was so used to drinking tea, she set the tone and fashion of the day, and she picked off the aristocratic obsession that the British developed with chai, and it was going to shake the rest of the world. I've had the fortune of living in these historic parts of the world. I lived in Bombay, and now I'm living in Boston. And what you see on your slide is exactly how the East India Company and its practices around tea impacted this part of the world, and it effectively triggered the American Revolution and cost the crown arguably one of its most precious colonies of the day, which is the original colonies on the East Coast of the United States. And what we see is that originally the East India Company, it was just a trading company, and it became increasingly political in nature. And it was actually one of the earliest examples of a multinational corporation that had international links, and it was connecting different countries and the known world together at that point in time. And it had started to abuse its power with taxation and with gross margins. So both the East India Company as well as the Crown, they wanted lots and lots of taxes And taxation without representation, as you know, was a big slogan, and the Americans wouldn't have any of it. And that led to, the Boston Tea Party. Now, back in India, the British saw a huge opportunity to design the Indian landscape and economy and turn it into the biggest source of chai to them and the rest of the world. And the British Empire's worldview not only disregarded the code of conduct, ethic, and ritualistic sensitivities of South Asia, it actually stood in complete opposition to it and sought to leverage it in their favor every way possible. So now, if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see that the colorism has progressed, and it's crossed genetic boundaries now. And we see that the lactose intolerant natives of India had a layer of aspiration with the pro-dairy rich, Mughal court that had ruled over them. And now, with the advent of the more dairy tolerant British and chai loving British, there was a genetic supremacy, if I can say that, which obviously is visible in the most coloristic sort of a fashion, which wasn't as apparent earlier. And I personally, I think it was still pretty apparent, because the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas had indeed, descended from the West Eurasian gene pool. So they were visibly of a different complexion. But if you can see that the stratification in India of the caste system just reinforced the white supremacy idea, that the British, and worked in favor of the British. So now we're going to look at the three, the trifecta, the three pillars: tea, sugar, and dairy, very quickly. Now, as the British developed the tea habit, their own tea habit, they wanted to break China's monopoly on tea production. And the big important point to note here is the Chinese emperor was willing to trade tea, but he was only willing to trade it in silver. And silver and gold reserves were very precious back then. Every economy wanted to hold on to it, especially the British Empire. They didn't want to drain their silver and give it up to China and the Chinese Empire. So they decided that India was going to be the place where they planted tea. There was a person called Robert, and he smuggled lots and lots of tea plants out from China illegally, brought them into the northeastern part of India. They started with an indigenous tea plant, which already existed in Assam and Bengal, in the northeastern part of India. But then they started using the smuggled tea plants and built a vast system of plantation agriculture that was fueled by indentured labor. By 1888, India was the largest exporter of tea to the West, and especially to the British Empire, and not China. So that's how they actually broke the monopoly of China on tea production. Next, when we look at sugar, because the British, for them to be able to have tea, they needed dairy, they needed sugar, and they needed the tea. They actually actively sidelined the sugarcane industry, this very tiny fledgling industry that existed in India at the time, which primarily produced jaggery or gur, which is minimally processed, and it's a derivative of sugarcane. They introduced large-scale industrial production of refined white sugar and systematically issued edicts and laws and passed these acts that captured all the employment opportunities in the village industries that manufactured traditional forms of sugar, but actually changed it into the white sugar plantations that they wanted to plant, and the white sugar manufacturing capacity, a lot of which was exported once again to Great Britain. And millions of Indians were also transported transatlantic and trans-Indian Ocean. They reached South Africa, they reached the Caribbean, they reached eventually the United States as indentured labor, only to fuel the sugarcane industry. When we look at dairy, the first ever dairy farms in India were established by the Department of Defense of the British Empire. There's this short timeline over there. Starting in 1886, they established these farms to supply milk and milk products to the British troops. So once again, the colorism in action right there. If I'm a colonized Indian way back in 1886, I'm looking at this white liquid, which I rarely consume. I don't have access to it, especially if I'm a lower caste person. And I think of it as liquid gold. And all of a sudden, there are these dairy farms being established. I don't have any of it. Everything goes to the white soldiers who are, deputed and deployed in India. 1914 preliminary study. They wanted to understand if Indian cows were worth it. They decided, nah, Indian cows weren't cutting, cutting it for them. 1916, an imperial dairy expert was appointed. 1919, the first livestock census ever in India was carried out as preparatory action for planned dairy development was taken. 1920, they set up the management and the training center to meet manpower requirements for the defense dairy farms on scientific lines. When I say scientific lines, I mean actual seeding the seeds for artificial insemination, scientific breeding, bringing over of the Holstein cows, the Swiss Browns, and all of those European cows, which were obviously superior. So now all of a sudden, if you're Indian, you're not only looking at the white person as the superior race in front of you, you're also looking at their cows as more superior than your own.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And then it doesn't stop there, Chef AJ. There's policy-induced famine and malnutrition that paved the way for turning India into the largest domestic market for eventually for all of the things that were being exported by the British, because they also wanted to nurture India as the big domestic market after a while. And that fueled and set the stage for India needs animal-based protein. So it goes from, India goes from, or South Asia goes from a high fiber, complex carbohydrate, whole food plant-based consuming region to a severely malnourished, protein, energy, malnutrition sort of diseases, were rampant, that kind of a region. And when you look at, what's on this slide is it's actually a research that I chanced upon. It's actually the only existing systematic analysis of taxes and the taxation policies during the during the British rule in India from 1765 to 1938. And a public accountant and an analyst, she calculated that the British Empire drained a total of nearly $45 trillion from India during this period, and that's 17 times the GDP of the United Kingdom today. And during this time, people died of famine, income in India collapsed by half, life expectancy of Indians dropped by a fifth. And what you see is on the right side is, Indian poverty has been exported by a lot of international development agencies. India is deficient, and obviously, then you turn around and you say, oh, we're going to give you, we've left your country, but we're going to give you a lot of foreign aid. And United Nations and everybody else is going to jump in and set you up with, loans, which actually came from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They sent a lot of funds to India to set up an animal-based protein infrastructure in modern India. And that was the start of welfare economics. And this went on to become a big case study that was actually taught in business school when I went to business school. It's actually a Harvard Business School case study as well. And one welfare economist of India actually got the Nobel Peace Prize for it as well. And another one wrote a book called Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And C.K. Prahlad is, I think, the author. But we'll have a look at how welfare economics worked for India. But first, it's important for us to revisit this fantastic pyramid of access or lack of it. I was visiting the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, and I heard the statement, and it has never left me. I actually took note of it in my journal, and I wanted to share it with our viewers today. The legacy of the colonizer isn't the broken systems they left behind. Their legacy shows up in the scars that are seared on the colonized mind, the way the colonized person views himself or herself, his or her skin color, his or her very identity, and in that firmly branded belief that everything that the white man stands for is superior. Let that sink in for a minute. You're in 1947. India has achieved independence. A war-torn Great Britain has, left a lot of its colonies. And what you have in front of you is a severely malnourished India. It has been partitioned into two countries, which eventually by 1971 will turn into three. British India, a lot of people don't know, turned into Pakistan, turned into Bangladesh in 1971. And it's burning up in the violence unleashed amidst the largest human transmigration that the world would ever see since World War II. About 16 million people were displaced. Millions died. Punjab, my home state, was one of them. And there was a line that was actually drawn right through the heart of Punjab called the Radcliffe Line, where some people found their bathrooms left in modern day Pakistan and their bedrooms in India by a cartographer that had never once stepped foot in India as he was drawing these lines. So in 1947, you have a country where the need for food security, pressure to alleviate poverty, and spurring export-oriented dairy production that shaped Indian government's pro-dairy policies and the federal grants, international agriculture tech transfer programs, and much more. Because the shape of India's GDP had been altered almost permanently. So you have these sugarcane fields and you have the setup that the British left from the sugar refining industry. You have the tea gardens and you have the dairy farms. And those are the things, those are the toys you play with. And on top of it, you believe it's the right thing to do. So that's what you invest in as a newly independent country. So Dr. Verghese Kurian, this person, he's widely regarded as the father of the dairy revolution in India. He kickstarted what's called the Anand experiment. Initially in the 1950s, he went to Nestle's headquarters in Switzerland. It's a widely documented conversation. It's anecdotal. It apparently Nestle mocked his ambition and they said, no, Indian dairy cows can't really cut it. You're going to have to work with us and import a lot of our, Nestle products, etc. You can't do it on your own. So jilted, spurned, he comes back and his ego is bruised and he finds just the right time because India had just, been through the war with China and the Indian troops were supposedly malnourished. So obviously, they took a reference from what the British had done for their own troops when they were, positioned and stationed in India, and they took advantage of the military farms that had been set up, and they realized that if Indian troops had to be healthy, they had to be given dairy protein. So one of the earliest milestones that India achieved was converting river buffalo milk to dried skimmed milk powder. That is hailed as one of the technological advances in the dairy industry that came right out of India. And the National Dairy Development Board of India was born in 1965. Very quickly, and this is something that I lived through. I was born in 1980. And my parents, as I mentioned, were part of agricultural universities, the Punjab Agricultural University, State Agricultural University in that state. They were all part of the dairy revolution. Infrastructure was set up in the first 10 years. European Economic Community, World Food Program helped India. Early 80s, World Bank gave a loan, direct marketing strategy, expanded production of milk, to several million liters a day. Phase 3, foreign hybrid varieties of cows were brought in because obviously the Indian cows didn't cut it. They were considered poorer yields. Growth hormones started. Indian government actually borrowed heavily from the USDA's Got Milk campaign and started airing that in 1993. And then finally, the Indian dietary guidelines were launched. Textbooks became the favorite vehicle, as they are in the US as well, of generating dairy awareness and embedding that idea that dairy is a complete food amongst school children. Chef AJ, so far.
You know, I can't help but keep thinking about what you called the sugar, tea, and milk about being the trifecta, because I think of it as the evil trinity, because each of those things, the caffeine from the tea, the sugar by itself, the dairy, all three of those things are addictive. And then you're putting them together every day in a beverage that is now even more addictive.
Yes, exactly. So when we actually look at, I'm a board certified health and wellness coach as well, and obviously with a leaning toward whole food, plant-based eating, and I'm going to share with you, an initiative that I launched along with a friend with regards to this. Um, you know, we we've got a forum online. It sources the South Asian diaspora as well as Indians living in India from over 53 different countries. About 2,000 people are a part of it. And the big question that we get asked is, I can do everything else. I can give up everything else. Do not ask me to give up my chai. People have been enslaved by chai, and just the way people think about coffee in the Western culture. A sizable percentage of Indians, South Asian culture is just so enslaved by the concept of chai that they're addicted to it without realizing how it's controlling their life, their health. And then dairy, which is absolutely addictive, and it's got so much, and it's problematic, and it isn't even their own, but people think it's theirs, and so they've been gaslighted into believing that it's theirs. And we've seen that it really isn't theirs, and it never really was. So finally, this is the outcome, right? The abundance of dairy and abundance of diabetes. So what I've put side to side, head to head, are figures from 1954 to 2020. 17 million tons of total milk production, and now in 2020 it's close to 208 million tons of milk. India doesn't export much of its dairy. It's actually a consumer of dairy. So whatever it's producing, it's actually consuming a lot of it. And the incidence of diabetes has skyrocketed. It's the diabetes capital of the world. And for people my age, as I discovered 5 years ago, persons born in the late 70s through 80s are the first ever generation of South Asians to have experienced abundance of dairy. So it's not our ancestors, the Vedic ancestor. It wasn't Lord Krishna who was swimming in dairy, as mythological advertising will have us believe. It's really the modern day experiment, aided and abetted by the colonizers as well as the current government, that has led to this abundance of dairy. And when we look at this, India, it's come a long way, the Indian dietary macronutrient ratio since 1947. Obesity and diabetes is rising. Doctors are fitting gastric bands on children as young as 13. India already has more than 14% of its adult population suffering from diabetes, and this is diagnosed diabetes. There are more people who are living with undiagnosed, uncontrolled, blood glucose levels. Medical professionals expected to become 100 million, and again, there is a lot of research around the thrifty gene theory that says that Indians tend to be more genetically predisposed to developing diabetes. And whoever looks at that scientific evidence, and I'm not a medical professional or a scientist, but even I can see upon reading those that the thrifty gene theory really, really kicks in when all of a sudden there's a knee-jerk change, a paradigm shift in the macronutrient ratio of a population versus what their genetic makeup has been used to since the olden times. And that in and of itself should be enough evidence for anyone who's actually looking for scientific evidence to note that Indians genetically cannot have a high fat, high cholesterol, animal-based, high protein diet. It's just not going to work for them. It's not going to work for any human being over a period of time. It's specifically not going to work for them. So when we look at the Indian diaspora, when you look at Indian Americans, you see the onset of diabetes as early as the late 30s or early 40s. And once the disease has taken root in Indian Americans versus white Caucasian Americans, you see a more rapid progression and more intense symptoms quickly setting in the Indian American patients. So clearly pushing more animal protein will only add to the highly inflammatory, dietary cholesterol. Now here's another situation. There are two Indias. There's urban India where diabetes is becoming more and more rampant, and then you still have the malnourished India. And the Indian government has been pushing for dairy on both fronts. It's been pushing for animal, protein. Understandably, beef and pork not going to fly in India, so obviously the default tends to be chicken. They've been pushing chicken in a big way. They've been pushing eggs in a big way. So now the new evil trifecta is going to be dairy, chicken and eggs, and unfortunately, they have a really wrong definition or a really wrong target or goalpost. So if your goal is of a 2,000 calorie diet to achieve protein, certain grammage of protein that is dictated to you by the Western narrative on the need for animal protein on your plate, then obviously you're going to fall short, because it's a highly populous country. It's 1.36 billion people. And on an average basis, to be able to feed that much amount of dairy, eggs, and chicken, it's going to need a lot. And that is the direction in which the economic efforts, nutritional efforts of the government and corporations that are aiding and abetting all of this is going towards, unfortunately. And I just want to take a quick minute, Chef AJ, to talk about another dangerous myth that has arisen in India. So one of the new narratives in India at this point in time is about revivalism. So there's this whole newfound patriotic identity that a lot of Indian, people, want to live by. They don't believe that the foreign, quote unquote, the foreign cows, the insemination is the right thing to do. And their interpretation of it, and actually the industry interpretation of it, is once again, profiting them, because they're going to hold the ear either this way or the other way, right? So they're starting to say that the artificial cows, the artificially inseminated breeds of cows, are foreign cows, and therefore they're bad for health. But the Bos indicus cow and the cow milk derived from that cow is actually good for your health. And interestingly, this actually came out of a study that evidenced natural genetic polymorphism in cows. It happens in all species. There's genetic mutation that tends to happen, and it turns out that naturally, the Indian cows, which are the Bos indicus cows, they don't have the A1 casein in them. They have the A2 casein in them. And that's now feeding this marketing myth that started with the A2 milk company. And I think that they were out of New Zealand. They started selective breeding. They even started calling it hypoallergenic milk for people who are, aren't able to process casein and they're allergic to casein. So they're looking at casein and they're saying A2, A1, the desi cows, which are the Indian indigenous cows, are better. Now, and then A2 ghee has benefits. Little realizing that ghee is ghee. It's oxidized cholesterol. It's 100% clarified butter. It's fat, and it probably has trace amounts of casein, or maybe none at all, and definitely doesn't have lactose. So it doesn't really matter whether you've gotten ghee from A2 or A1 or A5. It's all the same. It's toxic. It's cardiotoxic for you. Now, bovine dairy is not for humans. I already mentioned ghee is cardiotoxic. A2 meth is perpetuating selective breeding and creating designer cows. And A1 casein is as is, it's rare in Bos indicus. So it's actually become a premiumization business case. Dairy sector is heavily subsidized the world over. It's a loss-making sector, as we know, here in the US, and it's true for India as well. And it's a low margin making sector. So if you can diversify your portfolio and you could start offering product lines that you can say, this is Ahimsa milk, stress-free milk, this is A2 milk, or this is Ahimsa ghee, this is Ayurvedic ghee, and so on. So it's revivalism. It's once again feeding on that myth of, the cult of Lord Krishna, the myth that Vedic people, traditionally had abundance of all of these things, which we've, surmised that they really didn't. And if they did, they weren't cooking with it. They were using it in the form of a pharmaceutical ingredient. So this is a very dangerous turn that, a part of the dairy sector in India seems to be taking at this point in time. It's not just in India, it's also attracted a lot of buyers from within the diaspora, and even non-Indian people who want to follow Ayurvedic kind of a diet. And in this story, here's the saddest part. This one thing in the research makes me very sad. Was it really the cow that made this happen? Here's the bovine, the other bovine, where 50% of milk that is produced in India is actually sourced not from the cow, not from the venerated Bos indicus. It's from its poor cousin, river buffalo. India has 98 million of them, 69% of the river buffaloes in all the world. And they're the most abused, neglected mammal in India, and they have no legal protection. And this is a travesty. But there is hope. And that brings me to the last slide that I had to share with our viewers today. The Whole Foods plant-based movement is gaining strength in India too, and amongst the diaspora. I've highlighted a few brands that are doing it. On the right is Divinity, which is the nonprofit which I run, the Versa Foundation out of Boston. We do a lot of research programs. We've done a lot of legacy, field work in India, where we've worked with the Northwestern Indian rural artisans, women artisans. We've partnered with, faith-based organizations and Sikh temples and Hindu temples, and brought whole food, plant-based, oil-free culinary demonstrations to these villagers who also happen to be small-time dairy farmers. You see on the left, Live Must, whole food plant-based support group. This is a free for everyone Facebook community forum. Everyone is welcome, regardless of whether you have South Asian origin or not. We talk about whole food, plant-based, oil-free eating. There's Sattvic Movement, which is a fantastic organization. They have over, I think, 2 million viewers on YouTube. And they're a Delhi-based organization. They talk about whole food, plant-based, oil-free. Rethinking Food and Agriculture, the brilliant new book that has been released recently by my dear friend, Dr. Leila Qasem, who's based in the UK. She wrote it along with her father, Dr. Amir Qasem, who's with the FAO. And they connect the dots of corporatization of agriculture, monocropping, dairy, and all the problems associated with it. Vegan First, is a big media platform out of New Delhi in India. They've been hosting all India vegan conferences. More and more, they've started to feature a lot of lifestyle medicine professionals and holding panels around whole food, plant-based eating. Sharon India, once again, a large organization. Dr. Nandita Shah has written books around preventing and reversing diabetes. Sampurna Ahara is another new. It's a cloud kitchen. It's out of Bangalore. They deliver whole food, plant-based, oil-free meals, and also donate meals. They've donated them during the pandemic. It was started by a naturopathic practitioner in Bengaluru, Dr. Achyutan Eswar. And Jiva Bhavna is another organization based out of Pune in India, and they're working towards creating veganic agricultural systems such that dairy farmers who do not anymore want to practice dairy farming in India, want to go away from it, have an option that they can still earn a wage, a living wage, using veganic agricultural practices. With that, we come to an end. Chef AJ, I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope you and our viewers found this interesting.
Well, I found it amazing, and I have a few questions, but first I want to say that the Ahimsa milk, I've heard everything now. That's like saying there's such a thing as humane meat.
Yes, exactly.
Just, this seems to me, Nivi, that this is more than just a health issue. It's a social justice issue.
It definitely is. It's a social justice issue. It's an intersectional issue at so many different levels. It's really about peeling all the layers so that people can connect the dots. It's about peeling the layer and the veil of colonialism. It's about it's really about planning cognitive dissonance, because we know that once people feel that, oh my God, I was sold this story, it was of deliberate design, and it ruled my nutritional habits, it ruled my sense of pride about my culture, sources of pride, with regards to my culture. So for instance, when I was growing up, the dairy revolution was a big deal. My parents were teaching and researching at a local state university, and also part of the tech transfer that happened with the US universities of the day, with green revolution and so on. And I grew up as a very proud Punjabi, thinking that my state was feeding the rest of India, because we had helped India achieve self-reliance as far as crops were concerned, wheat and rice, and as far as dairy is concerned. Now it turns out none of those three were actually consumed in my part of the world, and so I felt disillusioned, and that's where it became a social justice issue for me, and not just a health issue, because I felt like I was conned, I was taken for a ride, and that there are people who are born, who live their life a certain way, eat a certain way, and then they're gone without realizing that they were just part of this big design, which wasn't remotely traditional or ancestral in nature.
Soon after your medical emergency and you received your diagnosis, did you become whole food plant-based, and how did you even hear about it?
That's a very good question, because I was so sold on the ketogenic diet, and ketogenic industry does a very good job of marketing to marketeers such as me, and I took, from until March 2015, when the diagnosis happened, I did not go whole food plant-based oil-free until April 2018. It took me 3 solid years. It took me a sabbatical that turned into, just quitting the corporate world. I just realized I didn't want to do it. It took me lots and lots of coaching programs. I chanced upon Mastering Diabetes coaching program, and also Precision Nutrition, which is all about habits and habit building and so on. And that's where I chanced upon the documentary, because it was suggested by both of these coaching programs. Actually, in the Mastering Diabetes, the Facebook group, people were talking about it, and then Precision Nutrition actually mentions it as part of their coaching program for people to watch. And once I watched it, I just couldn't unsee what I had seen. And one of the biggest things that struck me was that when Dr. T. Colin Campbell in Forks Over Knives talks about a little known Indian journal had published a study in Hyderabad, and they were the ones that came up with, how casein was turning on tumor markers. I was stunned. I was like, oh my goodness, if there was one country where there is so much prevalence of, this notion that dairy is good for you, that's India. And if those scientists came up with it, what happened that they were silenced? What happened that it never, made it to Nature or Nat Geo or to a big conference? What happened? And it turns out that the Indian system at that point in time was just on a different trajectory, which we've seen in this document was Operation Flood and the Dairy Revolution, and there was no turning back for them. So that's how long it took me. 3 years, and then when I did go whole foods plant-based, it was overnight. My husband, who's American, he grew up in the Midwest, meat and potatoes, Germanic ancestry, and so on, didn't bat an eyelid. Both of us, we saw the science, we saw there was clinical evidence, we were both hurting, in our own way. I lost 38 pounds. I'm short. I'm very petite. I'm 5 feet tall, and I had 37% body fat. And my visceral organ fat was almost 8 on 10. And this is from bioimpedance analysis that I would get done. And I'm at 20% body fat at this point, a size 2. Not that I'm recommending, sizes to people, but just, sharing that I dropped close to 8 dress sizes. And I'm free of inflammation, and I lead an oil-free, whole foods, plant-based diet, and I don't miss a thing. I feel I'm full, I'm healthy, I'm experimentative and creative in my kitchen, and I feel happy. And I'm following Lord Krishna's guidance. I'm not following the mythological advertising that has been spun around his lifetime, but I'm following his food pyramid. And the sattvic mode of nutrition works for me and for my family.
Wow, that's incredible. Have you been able to influence any friends or family members?
Oh, yes. Both my mom and dad, within 3 months of me having gone whole foods plant-based, they started following it, especially my father. He was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 1992. He had end-stage kidney failure. And before he was infected with COVID, and we ended up tragically losing him in August of last year because he had underlying comorbidities. But the 3 years preceding to that, when he had gone whole foods plant-based, those were his happiest. Diabetes can lead to a lot of depressive symptoms, and a lot of his depressive symptoms actually lifted. He started having mangoes and other tropical fruits, and he was the happiest. And I think that's the most beautiful memory that my family, especially my mom and I, we live with, knowing that he ate amazing food to his fill, in his last years. So, and then my mom, who also went whole food plant-based, she reversed her arthritis. She reversed her hypothyroidism. She was also towards, being obese, and she's no longer obese. And she proudly tells anyone who would listen to it that, oh, I'm the same weight as I was when I got married, So she's like around 110 pounds and has never felt healthier or happier.
That's fantastic. How are you getting this message out, other than, obviously being on this show, but how are you getting it out to the people in India?
You mean the message of from our show? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I run a coalition, the Divinity Coalition, at my nonprofit, and we have close to 33 organizations around 6 different countries that are participating in it, of which there are 3 in India. So one of my, quickest, most immediate outreach will be, once this show is, out and I have a link to it, that I will be sharing it with the Indian coalition partners, and why not with the others as well, on my social media, and as well on the Divinity and the Versa Foundation social media, talking about how important it is for us to get the word out, and not just to Indians, but also to other parts of the world where similar experiences may have shaped their current understanding of dairy. And if they were to do a similar analysis, like you mentioned, Chef AJ, I'm pretty sure they're going to find exactly the same things.
Well, I'm very honored that you shared it here first. And of course, you can have a copy of the broadcast and share it far and wide. And I hope other people will as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been just such an amazing opportunity. And it's been a pleasure sharing my thoughts with you.
Oh, it was just really, like I say, I feel like I should have paid to go to a conference to hear a talk of this caliber. And you mentioned Dr. Shah. She is actually going to be on the show next month. And I appreciate her work, and I appreciate your work as well. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow for another fabulous guest.